We're joined up on Morning Kick Around now by Professor Stephen Bank of the UCLA Law School, an expert in sports law, as of course the NASL versus U.S. Soccer MLS trial has actually, or lawsuit has actually gone to trial. Stephen, welcome to the show. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we've gotten to this moment. We're at trial. I believe we've had opening statements. You can obviously catch us up on what has actually happened in court. But this was a long road. Why did it take so long to get to this point?
So antitrust trials always take a pretty long time, in part because there's uh, a lot of evidence-based collection. So it's both evidence as to whether the a conspiracy to restrain trade exists, which is usually not something that you can easily detect without a lot of depositions and fact finding. And then there's a lot of experts required for damages because the distinction in antitrust cases is usually between were you hurt by competition in the normal good sense or were you hurt by essentially the prevention of competition, and so all those things take a long time. In this particular case, I think what really happened is NASL filed their lawsuit in 2017, September 2017, and they asked for a preliminary injunction to prevent U.S. Soccer from, or to require U.S. Soccer to give them a D2 sanction. And
Right.
once they lost that in November of 2017, the season was effectively lost. The new teams that they were in negotiations with or had contracts with kind of disappeared, although I'm not sure they ever existed in real, that they were real serious candidates, but they said they had teams. And that meant that everything slowed down. And so there was a question about, for a lot of the existing teams, whether they stay in NASL and try to fight it or whether they leave. And a lot of them left. So that all that stuff really slowed the whole lawsuit. And it's really so it's taken probably longer than a normal antitrust lawsuit, which takes a long time because NASL has had the interest in continuing the lawsuit, but not the interest in all deliberate speed. I think in pursuing this, and U.S. Soccer, of course, as defendants often do, is not all that interested in pushing it to trial. So slow
Right.
since.
So just to kind of simplify this for people who maybe weren't around in 2017 or didn't know that this was happening, NASL is suing U.S. Soccer and Major League Soccer for a conspiracy colluding to prevent NASL from competing in the soccer market. Simply put, right? And you said it already that what NASL wanted in 2017, the injunction was to keep the second division status. They actually were arguing that U.S. Soccer was preventing them from having first division status, and that MLS was treated preferentially. That's pretty much the crux of this. Yes.
Yeah, it's uh, there's really there's kind of two or three things going on, to like axes of the claims. One is, U.S. Soccer and MLS conspired to prevent NASL from getting D1 status. Another basic one is that uh, MLS itself monopolized D1 status. In other words, preventing their teams from sort of entering the market for being a D1 soccer team. And then another is that MLS, US Soccer, and USL, which is not a defendant in the case, but is charged with being a conspirator, that they conspired to prevent NASL from being D2 status, right? Because they were denied D1 in 2016. They're pushed back down to D2. Then D2 is pushed down, would have been pushed down to D3. So there's like three sort of parts of this, but in general, it's about uh, um, in a legal sense, it's about the whether U.S. Soccer and MLS and USL to some extent prevented them from adequately competing in the market.
Representing NASL is Jeffrey Kessler, a guy who's been involved in a lot of these sports relevant antitrust suits. He was involved in Frazier versus MLS for people who remember when there was a challenge to Major League Soccer single entity structure. So, what is Jeffrey's approach here? What have you seen so far? What have you heard so far about the way that they're kind of going after this in court as they try to prove this conspiracy?
Yeah, so all we've gotten so far is opening statements, although Kessler spoke for like 2 hours and 15 minutes. So you can imagine. So everybody gets to speak in this thing. You know, you got MLS speaking, it has their own attorney, they're speaking, US Soccer speaking. So it's like a 6 hour opening statements. That does not bode well for the jury's attention span in this case. So what Kessler a lot of what Kessler's doing, Kessler's making the classic sort of little guy, big guy kind of argument. You know, the behemoths, the people with the power prevented, NASL from getting into the arena. So that's like the broad claim. It's actually a challenging claim, but that's the argument he's making. I say challenging because Rocco Camiso is anything but the little guy here. It's actually like a bunch of really rich guys fighting over
Yeah,
access to a club of rich guys, right? But that's part of it. The what he's got to do though, and you saw it in the opening statement, he's got to play defense from the get go. And here's his big problem. So you could even grant nobody's gonna do this. U.S. Soccer's not going to grant this. MLS isn't going to grant this. You could grant that there was um, unfair competition or some kind of anti-competitive behavior, whether it's through Soccer United marketing, whether it's favoritism on waivers, whatever it is. But if you don't win on the damages, it doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. And that's what happened in the USFL case against NFL.
right.
USFL years ago with Donald Trump as when he was part of it. USFL is suing NFL on antitrust grounds. They effectively won on. They did win on the antitrust side. They lost on the damages effectively because they got $1. And so the concern in the latter point, how do you get $1? The juries are instructed that you can't speculate about what part of the damages was because NASL was treated poorly, and what part of the damages was because NASL was incompetent or there's misfeasance, malfeasance, what have you, in how they were run. And as anybody who's run a business knows, there may be unfair things, but there's also things that you did that were you screwed up, so mistakes you made. So how do you allocate that? And so from the beginning, Kessler's defense has to be about NASL's management because there is so many really bad facts. Their commissioner Aaron Davidson was indicted and then convicted or pled guilty in the FIFA corruption scandal. Traffic was the organization that effectively ran NASL. NASL for a period of time was located in Traffic's headquarters in Miami, and Traffic was also indicted, convicted in the FIFA corruption scandal. And this is before a jury. So if you're sitting there as a jury and you're saying, "Wait, what? What happened there?" Like, let's go into the FIFA corruption scandal, right? And that just makes NASL look really bad. And that's putting aside the fact that NASL had teams collapsing. The San Francisco Deltas won the league and then were collapsing the next that year. So clearly things were not well. The kinds of teams they're bringing in weren't great. So in any event, Kessler's got to somehow distance NASL from the FIFA corruption scandal because that's a taint that's pretty big, and so he can preserve the possibility that he can win on the first part, that NSL was mistreated, and not lose on the second part, but
Right.
the mistreatment didn't cause any of the problems.
Wow. Yeah, I think anybody who was paying attention to NESL at the time recognizes there were a lot of missteps. There were a lot of things that they did that didn't make a lot of sense from a soccer perspective. And at the same time, I suppose if you rewind all the way back to the beginning, you could say, well, the the marketplace was already tilted very strongly against them because of the presence of MLS, which
Right.
of course had the backing of U.S. Soccer. Because at the time that MLS launched, there was nobody else trying to start. Well, there were other parties trying to start first division leagues, but obviously they wanted MLS to succeed. I was reading a story about some of the opening arguments, opening statements rather, from Front Office Sports yesterday, Stephen, and the headline is NASL trial could get in underbelly of American soccer. There's a possibility here that some pretty big figures could be on the stand at points. How likely is it that this is going to uncover something big, and this is going to be potentially a sort of seismic event in American soccer?
You know, there will be things, there'll be revelations that people will be intrigued by. Some of them of the very minor and trivial kind, like the one in that particular article, highlighting, I think it was in that article, but highlighting the MLS Council mentioned that you will see in trial that Rocco Camiso, the Cosmos owner, was tweeting in a burner account or a fake account, disparaging remarks about the other leagues. And that stuff like that really, in terms of practical effect, is nothing, but will be. I mean, if you're looking for this in purely entertainment value, there will be entertainment, is my guess.
Okay.
Entertainment to be found. If you're looking for it in terms of revelations that are massive to the future of soccer, I mean, there's a bunch of things that have already changed that you would say, well, that sounds bad. Like Soccer United marketing was a potential conflict because MLS started Soccer United marketing, US Soccer hired it. Don Garber then is on the board of US Soccer, commissioner of MLS, and ostensibly runs or oversees Soccer United marketing. There's things like that where if that was a revelation, like if people didn't know that, they might say, wow, that sounds really bad. Regardless of how that would affect the trial, in terms of long range implications, it's already blown up. Like that already doesn't, that Soccer Night marketing connection has been severed. I would have advised them to sever it a long time ago, not because there's actually a true conflict that caused any of this, but because it's just a bad look,
Right.
and US soccer is really sort of famous for really bad optics. They're good at it, apparently. And so, there's a lot of things that they could have done. So some of those things that are going to be in this trial that people will hear about, it's more like when you hear about a locker room scandal at the time, I really like to know the details. And then 10 years later, you find out the details like, oh, okay, but it's 10 years ago. And so that's some of this will feel like that. Now, Don Garber is still in his position. So, there could be, I suppose, if things were particularly bad for him, that could have current day implications. But, the commissioners have changed of U.S. soccer. Commissioners have changed of USL for that matter.
Yeah.
The NASL commissioners change. So a lot of the players are different. So I'm not sure you're going to have major things. Now, one reason you're not going to have a truly major consequence is because the judge granted summary judgment on count one of NASL's original complaint, although that was because NASL had effectively abandoned that claim. And that was that the professional league standards that U.S. soccer requires each league to meet was illegitimate, was illegal. And once that's gone, then the possibility you're going to have some kind of a result where U.S. soccer is forced to eliminate the PLS is off the table, probably.
Stephen, this is all fascinating. You and I have had many conversations over the years as legal things have unfolded in American soccer, and I keep coming back to a fundamental issue at play for American soccer, particularly for those people who want to see American soccer, you know, parallel what happens in some European countries, most notably because we see them as the standard bearers in the game, and that is sort of how antitrust law undermines the authority of U.S. soccer. U.S. soccer operates under this Ted Stevens Act, which gives it to the right to organize mainly national teams. Obviously, it's a bigger operation than that. But how do you square? I mean, with this trial ongoing, how do you square the need for an authoritative body to dictate how soccer operates, so that there isn't sort of all this fly by night things happening, shady characters, things going wrong, leagues popping up on top of leagues? How do you square that with antitrust laws that exist in the United States because it feels like these lawsuits are going to happen all the time.
Yeah, it's a so this is something that just a, a snippet of something I would teach in like my international sports law class is there's the North American model of sport and the European model of sport. And so a lot of US fans say, hey, why don't we have the European model of sport where we have promotion relegation, where we don't have teams that move cities, where the football association of the country and the national governing body and then the international governing body really has a lot of power in organizing the game and making sure it's sensible. And one of the things we're seeing happening in Europe right now is there's with the Super League. Super League actually, like, everybody was very controversial, right? But in court, Super League won
Yeah.
effectively, and FIFA and UEFA are going to have to deal with that. They didn't win practically, but they won legally. That's because they're applying their own version of antitrust law, competition law. But historically in Europe, the countries or the EU have always sort of stepped in to provide what is effectively an antitrust exemption. In the US, the antitrust applies to sports. Now, people talk about the Major League Baseball antitrust exemption. It's sort of a quasi exemption. The version of the exemption in the US would be, as you said, the Ted Stevens Act. Ted Stevens Act is not unique to soccer. Um,
Right.
it used to be like the Amateur Sports Act, but it's meant for the Ted Stevens Act is meant to give national governing bodies the sufficient power and exemption from antitrust law to organize their sport for the purposes of selection of national teams, because before the Ted Stevens Act in 1978, there would be lawsuits. And not just lawsuits among players saying, like, I should have been selected, but there would be competing governing bodies
Right.
arguing, no, the Taekwondo team is from us, not from them.
Yeah.
They're not the guys. We're the ones who picked them. And so
Yeah.
they said, no, we can't have that. You guys, we can pick one winner of the governing body race. That's not actually a governing body, but it is, but we're delegating them that power. Give them an antitrust exemption, and they can go about picking without worrying about that. And they can go out making certain choices that help their sport. Having said that, this was originally the Amateur Sports Act. Now the Olympics allowing professionals kind of threw that name into a little bit of a confusion, but it's still basically that. And so there's been one district court case on this, Champions World, which if you know Fraser, you might have heard of Champions World, another version of that case. And that case, the court said there's no antitrust exemption for governance of the professional sports, which is why that hasn't come up in this case. So U.S. soccer, though, is in an incredibly awkward position because they're a national governing body. Most pro sports in the U.S., national governing bodies are irrelevant. Nobody thinks about USA football, which, by the way, governs like flag football, and that's pretty much their biggest thing, but which is a big deal now with girls flag football growing by leaps and bounds. The NBA, they pick the Olympic team. They're maybe the NHL is the closest thing where a national governing body matters or an international governing body matters. But like FIBA doesn't matter for basketball. They're not telling LeBron James what's going to happen in the American game. So U.S. Soccer has this organizing body, membership association that has both the obligation and right to select national teams, organize international competitions, oversee the Olympics, when the World Cup's in the U.S. But they also have a governing body that a lot of people think should govern youth sports, youth soccer, and professional soccer. And both of those things, as much as people don't want to hear it, legally are businesses, and they're
Yeah.
subject to antitrust law.
Yeah.
And that's why when people say, U.S. soccer is just so sitting, lying down on the job, they should be in youth soccer, for example, they should be defining a path, eliminating all this like ECNL and whatever. That's an ECNL is a business. MLS Next is a business. You can't do that. Same idea in professional sports. So that's what largely prevents promotion relegation. Like the interesting thing about this NASL case is that The original complaint asked for no money. It asked for the professional league standards to essentially be eliminated to allow anybody to form a league, not be called D1, D2, D3, let the market decide, all of that. That is, if that had won, if that had stayed and that had won, that is like forever barring promotion relegation, right? So a lot of
Yeah.
people who were in favor of this would have been, wow, wait, that's not what we meant. We meant the little guys should have a chance to be in the one pathway, not that there be multiple pathways. And I'm not positive Camiso ever was a huge fan of anything other than I'm a wealthy guy and I should get to be in D1, right? I don't know that he was like, what should happen is this little guy should get into D1. It was more like I should be in D1. However, I get there, but that's the challenge. So the professional league standards are, um, as a legal matter, and I know this is getting into, if this is getting into too much detail, you can cut me off. But as a legal
Okay.
matter, here's the way antitrust law works. You cannot have unreasonable restraints on trade. So the word unreasonable leads to what's called the rule of reason approach, and it allows for you to argue that an anti-competitive a rule that restrains trade, right, prevents you from doing something, might actually have pro-competitive effects. And the argument in the preliminary injunction hearing under that count one was, hey, U.S. soccer is littered with failed leagues and failed teams, having some standards set by U.S. soccer as a trade association is pro-competitive in that it ensures that leagues don't operate and pull the rug out from under dedicated and devoted fans by putting out these teams that are not well funded, not well thought out, and that you can't really run a league. And I think that there are plenty of fans who are frustrated with leagues today. There's a couple leagues, the lower divisions, that are I think probably in questionable state right now, but also historically, the old NASL and leagues even before that, and so the ASL, and so
Hmm.
they're so they're allowed to do that. And by the way, FIFA allows them to do that even under promotion relegation. So this is why some promoted teams in Europe or in Mexico were not promoted, because they didn't meet the standards for the next level, whether it was stadium or something else. But the question is whether U.S. soccer did one too much of that. And really, in this case, because we've eliminated their ability to do that, is they can do, but they can't conspire to do that, like to like restrict one competitor. They could all agree, hey, we should have this standard, but we can't conspire. There's a bunch of things that are probably going to come out in this case that turn it on its head a little bit. Like my understanding is that NASL pushed U.S. soccer to adopt pro league standards. They didn't always have them when it broke away from they broke away from USL, because they
Hmm.
didn't want USL to be at the level of NASL. Um, that sounds like anti-competitive behavior. Um,
Yeah.
this is a fight among people who all want to be at the top more than it is a fight among people who want to fight for the populace, so to speak. But fair enough. I mean, that doesn't mean that NASL wasn't mistreated by MLS and U.S. Soccer. It could just mean that USL has an argument that NASL and U.S. Soccer also mistreated them. But that's always been the challenge for U.S. Soccer. The pro league standards are as kind of as far as they can go in truly governing the pro sport, and that's a question: did they go too far? And the case comes down to the application of those standards to NASL. Were they done unfairly? And that gets down to these things of waivers of the rules.
It's complex. It's deep. It's just starting in terms of the trial with NASL finally getting their day in court against U.S. Soccer and MLS. And Stephen, we may have a reason to talk to you again as things unfold. But we definitely appreciate you coming on the show and giving us a look at what's going on. Thank you for your time.
Quite welcome.
In the recording.